Well, greetings. It's Christmas, and I want to just share some thoughts about the event that happened that changed the world. There's a song we love to sing at Christmas time, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," and we all have visions of what it might have been like, but maybe it's different than you thought. Maybe the reality is different than your image of what happened. The prophet Micah said, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah." Now, that's a specific place. You see, there are three Bethlehems, but there's one in Judea, or was one in Judea, there is today, um, and it is called Bethlehem Ephrathah. What does that mean? Well, let's read the rest of it. "Though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times," or maybe a different rendition would be "from days of eternity." And so we think about that. We have a chance to look at it. I want to share some things with you today that might be a little different than you had thought. Of course, you know, Bethlehem means house of bread. And the one who said, "I am the bread of life," the one who said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven," was born in the house of bread. There was a man that lived there on a farm, probably, whose name was Jesse. And he had several sons. The runt of the litter was David. He was the sheep herder of the family at that stage of their lives. When Samuel came looking for a king to anoint at God's instruction, none of the big strapping older brothers were the right ones. And Samuel asked Jesse, "Do you have any more kids?" He looked at his wife and said, "Do we have any more?" She said, "Yeah, there's one out herding sheep. His name is David. Call him, have him come in." He was the one that Samuel anointed to be king over Israel. Now, David learned a lot of skills out there. He learned how to accurately sling a rock. He learned how to, probably, that's where he learned how to play a harp. He learned how to take care of his sheep and defend them from predators, of course. It's a very important time in David's life. And then when Samuel came along and anointed him king, or anointed him to be king. Now, the anointing with oil was an interesting event. Kings were anointed and prophets were anointed with oil. And so Samuel anointed David to be king. Now, it would be years before he'd actually take the throne, but he was the anointed of the Lord. And that phrase, the anointed of the Lord, runs throughout Old Testament and New Testament, down to the Messiah who was the fulfillment of the pictures that we think about. Now, an artist has pictured for us what Bethlehem might have looked like back in Jesse's time, the city of David. Now, I don't know whether it would have had all of those stone buildings. There might have been some, the synagogue and a few key structures might have been. Seems to me that it might have been a tent city. Of course, the artist has beat me to it, and so he has a concept that has become more popular than mine, but I think there might have been something like Bedouin tents out around the fields of Bethlehem and Bethlehem, so it might have been like this, or some of it might have been a tent city anyway, and Jesse and his family might have lived here. Some of the relatives, generations later, when Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem, might also have lived in tents like this. Now, there's a reason why I say that, and so we're going to look at the words. You and I know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. We read in Luke chapter 2, "So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth to Galilee, to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David." Now, there's something stimulates all of this. Why did he go? Well, there was a reason. So here's a picture of a shepherd with his sheep in the fields out around Bethlehem, and a more modern picture of Bethlehem in the background back there. And of course, since it was the breadbasket of Israel, this is where they raised their barley and their wheat. And so these are what are called the fields in the New Testament. So Bethlehem is in the tribal allotment of Judah. Jerusalem, on the other hand, is in the tribal allotment of Benjamin. Now, the Book of Mormon says that Jesus was born in Jerusalem. Well, that's a little bit like talking about Spokane, Idaho. It just doesn't quite fit. There's a mistake there somehow. And no one of that time, anybody who lived in Israel, would not have made that kind of a mistake. Bethlehem was in the tribal allotment of Judah. Ephrathah, on the other hand, means fruitful. Why is it fruitful? Well, because it's in the fields, but some of it goes into the gardens. There's an area called the gardens where fruits and vegetables grow. And the Bethlehem area, this portion of Ephraim, has some of it in the gardens and some of it in the wilderness where sheep grow. So the Bethlehem area, these acres of land around the little town of Bethlehem are fruitful because they have abundance of all three: the gardens, the fields, and the wilderness where the sheep are raised. So that's what we look at when we think of Ephrathah. It's also where the fields of Boaz were, and so that beautiful love story between Ruth and Boaz is part of the lineage of Jesus. And we're told that Ruth went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. And so he comes to be what we know as the kinsman redeemer. But he has fields in this breadbasket area around or outside of Jerusalem, and it's part of Bethlehem. So they raise sheep. Jesus is the Lamb of God, a sheep coming from that area, and he is the bread that came down from heaven. He is the bread of life, and that would take us back to the breadbasket. Now, there was a census, we're told, according to Luke chapter 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. So the way they took a census was to charge every man a coin. And then they just count the coins, and they knew how many men there were, and they didn't count women or children, just men. Now, Quirinius was governor twice, and so it looks like that this was during the time that he was first. And that may have been about 7 years before Christ. Well, yeah, I know, the calendar made a mistake. The priest that made the calendar didn't have everything exactly right. Didn't even know how to make sure that there was a zero in the calendar. So there's no zero. We go from 1 BC to 1 AD without stopping at a zero. So there are some errors, and so it may be that Jesus was actually born about 7 or 8 years before Christ. The traditional site about where Jesus was born is called the Church of the Nativity. And you can look down here, way back there in the back, there's a little black spot. That's the door. It's only about 3 feet high, and you have to duck to get in there. They did that deliberately. They wanted everybody to bow when they came into the Church of Nativity. It's been there for a long time. The site was identified by Constantine's mother, Queen Helena, and she went asking where it was, and somebody told her, well, it's right here. And so whether that really was or not, she got her answer, and that place is marked as the place where Jesus was born. They have it back in a grotto. That's a limestone cave that goes back quite a ways. And back in that cave is where Constantine's mother, Queen Helena, identified as the birth of Christ. So if you were to go into the chapel today and down a set of stairs over on the right, like this picture shows, down underneath there's a spot that they've identified. The Roman Catholic Church has identified this as the spot. And they have put down some nice stonework there to identify it, and a silver star, and then there are lanterns, and you can light a candle and burn it there, and there's room for candles up on top as well. There's another spot over in Shepherd's Field. It's also under a limestone cave, and it doesn't have a big church over it, but this one has been opened up, and it has been made into a little chapel, and a tour group can come in here and sing "O Little Town of Bethlehem" or "Silent Light," and have communion if they'd like. It's just really a very nice place, and probably represents the kind of a cave that Mary and Joseph had to use for her birthing. However, it seems to me that it's pretty harsh to think of an older man, say 40 years old, marrying a 16-year-old girl and them going to have a child, and he's going to be the midwife. He knows something about birthing, and God's going to just let this all happen in a cave. There's something about that just doesn't seem quite like the God I've come to know. There's another spot out behind the YMCA, which also is a limestone cave. This one, I've been there. I visited both of these. Well, I've been to all three of them. And I like this one better. I want you to notice the flat spot here in the foreground. And suppose that a Bedouin were to find this and pitch his tent over it. And pitch the tent so that not only was it over the flat spot, but the sides would also include the top of the cave as well. So the cave would be a part of his dwelling. Now at night, everybody had to sleep, and families were large, so you'd have 6 to 12 children perhaps, and each one would have a mat. In the evening they would roll out the mat and put the kids to sleep on the mats. And then the parents would be the last to lay down. They would roll out a mat, and they would be the first up in the morning, of course, because they have things to do. Also, we're told that Jesus was placed in a manger. We typically think of wooden mangers, but what they would have used, a manger would have been a feeding trough. And they're normally stone, something carved like this out of stone, and actually, this would have been the manger that Mary would have used to lay Jesus in, if that's how it happened, which Luke tells us it was. So nowhere are we told that Jesus was born in a stable. That's not really what it was. It wasn't a petting zoo, but it probably was in a limestone cave of some kind. What's interesting to us now is that Luke uses a word. He says the reason they had to use a cave is that there was no room in the inn. Now the Greek word that is used for inn is kataluma, and it is precisely the inner part of a Bedouin tent. It's called the inn, as opposed to the out, I guess. But there was no room in the inn. In other words, when all the children were laid down to sleep and the adults, there would have been no place for a young woman to give birth to a baby. And so there was no room in the inn. We often think it refers to some kind of a motel or a guest room or something like that. Actually, it just refers to the living room, the living area of the tent. It's where they would have their evening meal. On a rainy day, the children might come and be in out of the rain there, the whole family perhaps, but most of the time during the daytime, the kids would play outside and only be there in the evening for mealtime and for sleeping. This is what the inn of a Bedouin tent would look like. It would have curtains on the side to color the place, and then it would have these rugs or mats that would cover the floor. And so this is what I'm talking about. Everybody would have one of these to sleep on, and that would be their bed. Outside, The tent would not be particularly beautiful. The roof would be made out of goat hair. When it rained once and that got wet, it would never leak again. Now, I want you to imagine putting one of these tents over that area that I showed you had a flat spot and a grotto. And the sheep could be herded in through the tent because all of the mats would be up, and they could go back into that cave area. The sheep don't like to go into a cave, but they will if there are people there. So they could hang out back in there, and as long as there were voices and people, the sheep would be fine. So think about that with me. Suppose that back around on the right there is a nice little place where a table could be, and the Jewish mama could heat some water and she could midwife for a young lady about to give birth. She could tend in kind of a private place back there in the cave because there was no room in the inn. But back there in the cave, she could be taken care of by someone who knew what to do and how to go about the process. Now that seems so much more like the God that I have come to know. Oh yes, and it was a real baby that was born that night. And we celebrate that God became flesh. Someone said one time, if you're having trouble finding God, you're probably not just looking low enough. Because Jesus came down all the way down in human form to be born just like you and I were born. And there was probably a Jewish mama there to heat some water and to help in the and attend to the event of a woman in labor for the first time in her life. So much more reasonable and loving to think of a God who made provisions in this way. Well, we know that history was divided by the event that happened we call the birth of Christ. And typically we have talked about before Christ and Anno Domini AD. In more recent years, they've tried to eliminate Christ, but they still divide time by his birth. And they talk about before the Common Era, and then they talk about Common Era, but the 0 point is still his birth. It really is kind of funny how they try to get rid of Christ. Luke tells us that while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room in the inn. So these mangers have been found. They're all over in the ruins of places, villages and towns, and places where there might have been sheep. And sheep was something that all the families seemed to raise. That was their livelihood. They didn't have a Safeway and an Albertsons or whatever. They didn't have a Walmart and a Costco to go buy their meat in. They had to raise it. And so they would feed some of the barley, or maybe on occasion some of the wheat, to their sheep, and they used these feeding troughs. We called them mangers. And remember that the sheep that were grown there were grown for sacrificing on Passover in the temple area, and they were using the bread from the bread basket to grow them. It's an interesting thing that in this area where the fields of Bethlehem have, there was a natural hill that Herod the Great expanded. He raised it and modified it a bit and built himself a fortress. And from this fortress, he could have looked out and actually seen Bethlehem, the place where Jesus was born. It's amusing to me that this great king, this powerful king, himself a half-Jew, deeply committed to Rome, was threatened by the birth of a little baby in Bethlehem, and actually had to give an order that all the babies 2 years and under be slaughtered. What a loving person. Matter of fact, as Caesar said, it'd be better to be a dog than to be a relative of Herod's. It's kind of a play on words. So Herod built this fortress. It's called the Herodium. And they've excavated, found the stairway, and they believe they've actually found the tomb of Herod the Great as well. But from here, from this fortress, Herod might have been able to look out and just actually see Bethlehem. It's amusing that he died and the kingdom he was threatened by continues and is growing. But here's a picture now looking out over the Bethlehem area, the fields of Bethlehem. And you see there's a line that goes down to where Bethlehem is and another line that goes down to where Jerusalem is. So from the Herodium, you can see both Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Bethlehem's about 7 or 8 miles away from the heart of Jerusalem. Now here's a picture of old King Herod. Well, it may not be his picture, but it's a rendition of what he might have looked like in all of his finery and his decreeing. And here's a picture of the other king that was born not far away in Bethlehem. Well, it's not really his picture, it's a likeness of it, but it represents the event that you and I celebrate at Christmas time. Herod's kingdom was divided and has disappeared, and the kingdom that Jesus came to be king of has continued to grow globally. Oh, I know there's been a falling away in our day. The Bible talks about there being a falling away. But you know what? He's been transforming lives for centuries, and he continues to do it. The good news is he was real. He came. He came to be among us, Emmanuel, not to change our circumstances so much as to transform us. That's what Christmas is all about, and we celebrate his coming as we benefit from his presence with us. What a picture. Thanks for joining me, and next week I'll probably have a look at the Bethlehem Star, if you will join me again next week for these little insights. God bless you. Have a very Merry Christmas.